Hi guys. Tonight, we begin a journey into the shadowy corners of medieval life. A quiet, slow descent into the hidden suffering and resilience of those who toiled not on the battlefield or the throne, but in the mouths of the desperate. This is a story of a medieval dentist, though he would never have used such a word himself. A bone puller, a barber surgeon, a man with rusted pliers and rough hands. He lived on the edge of towns, tucked between butchers and blacksmiths, surrounded by the smell of iron and rot. Over the next 20 parts, we'll follow his life not in great arcs of triumph or tragedy, but in the small, quiet pains that marked each day, each extraction, each cry in the night. It's a story of blood, bone, and the quiet dread of waiting in line for the man with the hook. It was the summer of St. Ethelbert's feast, the kind that clings to the skin like old wine. In the southern shire of Thornwick, a village barely stitched together by muddy roads and crooked roofs, a man named Alaric kept a shop with no sign. The locals called him the Toothman, and even that was spoken with a curl of the lip, a superstition, as if saying his name too often would summon him to your doorstep, pliers in hand. Alaric was not old, but years had settled in the folds beneath his eyes. His beard was patchy and singed near the chin, evidence of his habit of leaning too close to his candle when inspecting rot. He walked with a limp from a long-forgotten accident involving a drunken mule and a cartload of pig iron. But none of that mattered to the villagers. To them, he was the man you only visited when the pain was too great to bear. That day, the line outside his shop began forming before the sun had properly risen. A girl with cheeks flushed from fever clutched her mother's skirts, her hand pressed tightly to a swollen jaw. A cooper's apprentice bit down on a leather strap, sweat beading on his forehead as he waited, his tooth black and crumbling. They did not speak much. They never did. Only the occasional moan or prayer passed among them, like wind through a graveyard. Inside, Alaric boiled water that would never be hot enough. He wiped down the iron chair that smelled of sweat and old blood. On the table beside him lay his instruments, his rusted pliers, a bent spoon, a length of linen, and a cup of stale ale. No herbs, no salves, nothing for comfort. Pain was the procedure. He started with the girl. Her name was Scylla. She couldn't have been more than 7 winters old, but already her left molar was rotting from the inside. Alaric inspected it with a shaking hand, muttering more to himself than to her. He saw the pinkish hue of infection, the way her gums puffed out like boiled meat. It had to come out. Her mother whispered words into her ear, promises of sweets and ribbons, anything to get her through. Alaric gave the girl a piece of bark to bite down on, instructed her to close her eyes. He counted backwards from 10, not to soothe her, but to time his grip. When he reached 6, he plunged the pliers into her mouth and twisted. The scream that followed was animal. The girl's legs kicked against the chair, her hands scratched at the air, and her mother cried out, begging for it to be over. But Alaric kept twisting, the rot making the tooth slick and stubborn. Finally, with a sound like a twig snapping, it came loose, and blood filled the girl's mouth. Alaric dropped the tooth into a tin bowl and wiped his hands on his apron, which was already stained deep brown. He handed the mother a scrap of linen to press into the wound. Neither thanked him. They left in silence, the girl sobbing into her mother's chest. Next came the cooper's apprentice, who didn't scream but vomited into the bucket when Alaric struck the nerve by accident. Then a widow with 3 missing front teeth, who only wanted the remaining one gone so she could chew on the other side. Then a boy who had tried to chisel his own tooth out with a knife and failed. By noon, Alaric's arms ached from the constant yanking. His eyes burned from the smoke of the candle, and his back screamed with each bend. He paused only to sip from his cup of ale and pour more water into the pot. There was no glory in this work, no title or coin worth mentioning. Sometimes he was paid in chickens or broth. Often he was paid in thanks, which never filled his belly. His hands bore the marks of his trade, small cuts from thrashing limbs, burns from the candle, and the ever-present smell of iron and blood. But worse than the physical toll was the sound. The screams stayed with him, echoing even after the shop was closed. At night, as he lay on the straw-stuffed mattress in the back room, he heard them still. The gasps, the cries, the terrible silence that sometimes followed when he knew he had gone too deep or too fast. Sometimes there was death. There was the mason's wife, Agnes, whose infection spread too far down the root. Alaric tried to dig it out, but her body shuddered and twisted beneath his hands until her breath stopped altogether. The villagers didn't blame him. They didn't have to. Their silence was worse. He buried her himself, just beyond the line of the hedgerow, and said no words. What could he say? On other nights he would sit by the fire and clean his tools, though no amount of scrubbing would make them shine. He remembered his father's hands, thick and calloused from smithing, and wondered if he should have taken up the hammer instead. But no one in Thornwick needed another smith. They needed someone to deal with the rot, the ache, the unbearable throb in the bones of their jaws. So he kept on. One evening, long after the last patient had limped away, a knock came at the door. It was late, and Alaric hesitated. But the knock came again, more urgent this time. When he opened it, a man stood on the step with a blood-soaked rag tied around his head. His eyes were wild, his jaw visibly swollen. He spoke in short gasps, asking, no, begging, for help. His name was Emmerich, and the pain had driven him half mad. He had tried to burn the tooth out with a poker. Alaric helped him inside, but something about Emmerich was different. The way he trembled, the stink of rot that came not from his mouth but from somewhere deeper, darker. Infection had likely reached the bone. Alaric knew what had to be done, and he knew it would not be enough. The room had gone quiet, save for the low, rasping breath that escaped Emmerich's mouth in broken rhythms. Alaric guided him slowly to the chair, supporting the man's weight with a careful grip under his arm. Emmerich sagged heavily, the way dying animals do when their legs can no longer remember how to stand. His sweat was thick and cold. Alaric smelled it now. Death, not yet settled, but close, pacing the room like a patient hound. The candlelight flickered on the walls, bending shadows around them like soft whispers. Emmerich's eyes rolled once, then steadied, locking on to Alaric's with a look not of hope, but of surrender. Alaric reached for his cloth, soaked it in lukewarm water, and dabbed gently at the man's jaw. The skin was stretched tight, red as butcher's meat. The swelling had crept down his neck, where dark bruising spread like ink. His mouth opened with effort, teeth bared in a grimace. And there, far in the back, was the cause. A molar. Blackened, split, pus bubbling at the root with each breath. It was worse than Alaric had feared. Not just infection, but necrosis. The tooth was dying, yes, but so too was the bone, the gum, the very tissue of the jaw. He had seen this only once before, long ago, in a stonemason who had fallen from a scaffold and cracked his jaw against a pillar. By the time Alaric had been called, the man could no longer speak. He died 2 nights later, unable to swallow, the rot having reached his throat. Alaric exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers into his temple. There was no choice, only action. He fetched his longest pliers, wiping them against his apron with practiced swipes, though he knew it was more gesture than sterilization. The iron was already warm from the heat of the room, and the scent of rust was sharp. Emmerich watched him prepare. He did not ask questions. Perhaps he had seen enough in Alaric's face to know the truth. Or perhaps the pain had become its own language, and words no longer mattered. He lifted his hand and rested it on the arm of the chair, knuckles white. Alaric didn't offer ale. It would delay things, blur the edge of Emmerich's consciousness, and in this state, delay was cruelty. He moved to Emmerich's side, mouth instruments in hand, and braced himself. "Bite down if you must," he murmured, voice barely louder than the flame. Emmerich nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement. His jaw quivered. The first touch of iron against the molar drew a hiss, but no scream. Alaric gripped, twisted, the tooth held. He adjusted, gripped again. A pop faint, like a knuckle cracking, and then a shudder. Emmerich made a sound then, something between a growl and a sob. Blood surged up, thick and dark, coating the pliers and spilling over Alaric's fingers. The tooth broke in half, jagged and steaming with rot. Alaric had to dig again, deeper now, scraping at the gum to find the other half, the root that remained buried. Each twist brought more blood, and Emmerich's body jerked, his free hand clawing at the chair. Then, with a sickening crunch, the second half tore free. It came out with a ribbon of flesh still clinging to it, the smell unbearable. Alaric tossed it into a bowl already half filled with gore. Emmerich slumped, eyes fluttering. Alaric wrapped a cloth tightly around the wound, pressing it into place to stop the bleeding, but even then he knew. This would not heal. The infection had already spread. He stayed beside Emmerich as the man's breathing slowed. He offered water, though Emmerich could barely swallow. His mouth was too swollen now, tongue heavy, throat thickening. They sat in silence. Alaric did not clean the tools. He did not prepare for the next patient. There would be none tonight. By the hour of matins, Emmerich was dead. Alaric covered his body with a coarse blanket, the same one he kept for winter drafts. He left the tools out untouched and opened the door to the night air. The stars were scattered like salt across the heavens, and the moon sat low, a pale coin above the rooftops. The streets of Thornwick were quiet, as they always were in the deep night. Only the wind moved, tugging at the corners of his robe, whispering against the wooden walls of nearby homes. Alaric stood there a long time, listening. He thought about the other dead, the mason's wife, the peddler who bled out after a slipped grip, the boy with lockjaw who never woke after the extraction. They came to him broken, desperate, hopeful in the worst ways, and he met them with hands that could only offer pain, a grim mercy. He remembered when he first began, years ago, apprenticed under a travelling barber named Hob. Hob was no master, only a man with a kit of sharp things and a taste for cider. But he taught Alaric the basics, how to feel for the root, how to twist instead of pull, how to smell the difference between surface rot and deep infection, and more importantly, how to keep his hands steady even when his heart rebelled. But Hob had vanished one winter, likely taken by the plague or by wolves. Alaric had remained too stubborn or too poor to leave. Thornwick needed someone to deal with the mouths, and he had grown used to the routine. He stepped back inside, bolting the door behind him. The room smelled of death. He did not light another candle. Instead, he sat by the cold hearth, resting his head in his hands. There were moments when he imagined leaving it all behind. He had no wife, no children, nothing to anchor him. He could travel north, disappear into the woods, take up the life of a tinker or a hermit. No more screaming, no more blood, just wind in the trees, birdsong, and silence. But the thought never lasted, because even in the silence he would still hear the sounds, the moans, the choked sobs, the final breaths. They were a part of him now, etched into his bones like old scars. When morning came, the village bell rang for prime. Alaric roused himself, slow and aching, and washed his hands with cold water. He wrapped Emmerich's body and placed it gently on a cart. There would be no ceremony. He would bury him beyond the hedgerow, as he had done before. The sun broke over the eastern hills, casting golden light across the muddy roads and crooked chimneys of Thornwick. A rooster crowed in the distance, and as the first knock sounded at his door, a new patient, no doubt clutching their jaw in agony, Alaric did not move. Not yet. He stared at his tools, still stained, still wet. And he waited. Perhaps word had spread that someone had died in the chair again. It wasn't the first time, but each death settled over the village like a fog, thickening the air with silence. People whispered more softly. Children were kept indoors longer. The baker left bread on his doorstep instead of greeting him with the usual nod. And the church bell tolled once, only once, for Emmerich. Alaric kept to the shop. He cleaned the instruments not for use, but because the routine was stitched into his bones. The same motions, the same order. Pliers first, then the spoon, then the file. He boiled water and scrubbed the blood from the bowl where the teeth were kept, though the stains remained, rust-coloured and stubborn. The fire in the hearth had gone cold, but he did not rekindle it. Let the chill settle in. He swept the floor slowly, the broom catching on dried flecks of blood. He paused to lift the rag where Emmerich had once sat, and beneath it, a patch of darkness, dried and curling at the edges like some wounded pet that had crawled there to die. He stared at it a long while, then laid the rag back over it and moved on. By vespers, he stepped outside. The village looked unchanged, slate roofs crooked with moss, smoke rising lazily from hearths, chickens pecking near the well. But the silence lingered. He walked to the edge of the hedgerow, where the earth was softer, newly turned. Emmerich's grave was marked by a simple stone, nothing carved, only the weight of it speaking the truth. Alaric crouched there, fingers tracing the clods of soil. He spoke no words, only watched the way the wind bent the grass around the stone, as if nature herself bent low in mourning. The sun dipped behind the treetops, dragging with it the warmth of the day. As night returned, he heard the first voice in days. "Are you the Toothman?" Alaric turned. A figure stood just beyond the edge of the hedgerow, half-shadowed, as if the world hadn't decided whether or not she belonged to it. She was cloaked, hood drawn low, but he could see the curve of her cheek, pale and smooth. She was younger than most who came to him, no older than 20. Her voice, though steady, carried something brittle beneath it, like glass worn thin. "I am," Alaric replied, rising slowly, the stiffness still in his legs. She stepped closer, revealing a mouth wrapped in linen, blood soaking through in deep splotches. Her hand trembled as she lifted the cloth. A gash ran along her jaw, fresh and deep, and then she spoke again, carefully, each word pulled through clenched teeth. It wasn't rot. It was him. Alaric said nothing at first. He looked closer at the wound, thin, precise, the kind no infection could cause. Not torn by illness or bitten by bad luck. A knife, perhaps. A strike. He'd seen wounds like this in bar brawls and among field hands during bad harvests. She sat without being asked, though the chair was cold and stained. She was used to discomfort, that much was clear. Her hands bore small scars, the kind that come from daily labour. Fingernails broken, palms calloused. She was no stranger to pain. He fetched a new cloth, soaked it in water, and gently dabbed at the blood. The woman flinched but did not protest. The gash had split beneath her cheekbone, where a tooth once sat. He peered inside her mouth, 2 teeth gone, ripped out not by disease, but by force. He fetched his tools. She watched with wide, wary eyes. "It was my brother," she said quietly. "He said I stole coin from him. I didn't. He drank it, came at me after dusk with the carving knife." Alaric didn't ask questions. He cleaned the wound with water, then with vinegar. Her breath caught, but she did not cry out. He packed it with a poultice of dried thyme and sage, ground together and steeped in spirits. It would do little, but it was what he had. "You'll need to sleep sitting up," he said, voice low. "If it swells more, the breath won't come easy." She nodded. "Can I stay here tonight?" Alaric paused. He had never shared the shop before, but the fire was out and the room was bare. No one would come looking, and the silence of the village weighed heavier with each passing hour. "Yes," he said. She curled against the hearth, wrapping herself in her cloak. He offered her an old blanket, more holes than wool, but she accepted it gratefully. As she drifted to sleep, her breath growing even and slow, Alaric sat by the window. The sky above Thornwick was heavy with stars, unmoving, eternal. He did not sleep. He watched the shadows. He listened to the night, to the distant bark of dogs, the creak of timbers settling. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called out. And he wondered, as he always did, why the work he did, the blood, the pain, the silence, never truly ended. The fire was nothing more than a few glowing coals when the girl stirred. Dawn had not yet broken, but the air had shifted. The kind of hush that came before the crows woke, before the wind stirred through the trees. Alaric had not moved from his place by the window. His back ached from the stool, but he dared not sleep, not with a stranger breathing beneath his roof, not with the image of her torn cheek still fresh behind his eyes. She sat up slowly, her eyes blinking against the pale dark. A smear of blood had dried on her neck, brittle and brown now. Alaric offered her water, and she took it without a word. She did not thank him. People rarely did. But she drank slowly, with purpose, and when she was done, she held the cup close as if it had weight beyond its contents. "I should leave," she murmured, her voice like gravel in her throat. Alaric said nothing, only nodded. He stood, bones groaning beneath him, and fetched a strip of clean linen. He unwound the old bandage from her face. It had stuck slightly where blood had dried, and examined the wound beneath. The cut was deep, but clean. Swelling had lessened, which surprised him. The herbs had done more than he thought. He packed it again, this time with a finer powder of dried marigold petals, mixed with beeswax and rendered fat. It smelled faintly sweet, like summer on a distant hill. She winced, but held still. When he had finished, he looked her in the eyes. "You'll scar," he said quietly. She didn't flinch. "I know." Alaric wrapped the new bandage carefully, tying it at the base of her jaw with fingers that had bound 100 wounds. As he stepped back, the faintest line of sunlight broke over the edge of the eastern hill, brushing the floorboards with a gold that felt too soft for the place they stood. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "Mera." He nodded once. It was a northern name, cold rivers and tall pines. She stood slowly, gathering her cloak, the blanket falling away from her shoulders. The silence stretched between them like fabric on a loom, tense, unfinished. "You should go west," he said at last. "Away from Thornwick. There's a cloister near Eldmere. They won't ask questions." Her eyes flicked toward him. Suspicion, gratitude, perhaps both. "Why help me?" Alaric didn't answer. He turned away, returning to the tools on his table, laying them out once more in a line of iron and rust. He heard her steps behind him, light, purposeful. Then the door opened, creaking against the morning stillness. She was gone. That day, the wind carried the scent of hearth smoke and wet earth. Villagers emerged slowly, cautious of the passing of death, but hunger does not wait for morning. The market square buzzed with soft footsteps, with muttered exchanges of bread and turnips, with buckets drawn from wells and knives sharpened on stones. No one came to the shop. Alaric busied himself with the finer tools. He oiled the hinge of a jaw hook he had inherited from Hob, a brutal thing, used for holding open the mouths of the unruly or the terrified. He rarely used it, only when the swelling was too great or the fear too paralyzing. He sat with a tooth he had pulled weeks ago, one of the largest he'd ever seen. He carved into it with a small chisel, tracing runes from Old Tongue, the language of healers before scripture took hold. It was foolish work, meaningless perhaps, but his hands needed purpose. The tooth crumbled slightly under the blade, chalky with age. By noon, the sun had risen high and harsh. The door creaked open again, but it was not a patient. It was Old Worm, the tanner's wife, a bundle of herbs in her arms. She stepped inside like one who knew ghosts might be watching. "You still alive in here?" she asked, her voice sharp with age but not unkind. Alaric nodded, not rising. "Good, thought we'd lost another one." She set the herbs on the counter, sage, yarrow, some stalks of wormwood, a trade offering. She didn't speak of coin. She never did. "There's a boy in the outfield," she added. "Says he broke a tooth on a plum pit, won't stop crying." Alaric looked up. "Where?" "West of the Commons, near the burned shed." He stood slowly, his limbs aching. He gathered a small kit, a pair of shorter pliers, linen and a jar of crushed mint. Not to numb, but to distract. The taste was strong and bitter, enough to pull the mind elsewhere for a time. The Commons were quiet. Crows hopped along fence posts, picking at things best left unexamined. The shed had burned 2 summers ago in a lightning storm, and its charred beams still jutted from the ground like broken ribs. Beneath its shadow sat a boy, no more than 8. His cheeks streaked with dirt and tears. He looked up as Alaric approached, wide with pain. "My tooth, it hurts." Alaric knelt beside him, setting the kit gently in the grass. "Let me see." The boy opened his mouth. The molar had cracked clean across, half still anchored, the other jutting at a cruel angle. Blood had pooled beneath it, fresh and thin. Alaric didn't speak. He braced the boy's head with one hand and reached for the pliers. "No, wait," the boy began, but Alaric was already moving. A twist, a pull, a soft snap. The boy screamed. His hands balled into fists, birds startled from the trees nearby. But it was done. Alaric packed the wound with mint and pressed a cloth into the boy's hand. "Bite this." The boy obeyed, sobbing. Alaric sat beside him as the wind passed gently over the fields, warm and green-scented. They sat together for some time. "I'm sorry," the boy whispered at last. Alaric didn't reply. There was nothing to forgive. Only the work and the ache it left behind. The walk back to Thornwick was quiet. Alaric let the boy lean against him, one small hand clutched tight around the cloth, blood spotting its corners. His steps were slower than usual, not from fatigue, but to match the rhythm of the child's trembling legs. They passed hedgerows laced with spider silk, and the distant bleating of goats echoed from the hills. No one watched them. The fields were still, and the air had grown heavy with late afternoon heat. When they reached the edge of the village, a woman appeared from between 2 thatched cottages. She looked no older than 30, though worry had drawn lines where youth once rested. Her apron was stained with flour and sweat. Her eyes widened at the sight of the boy, and she hurried forward. "My God, Tolan!" she cried, her voice catching as she dropped to her knees. The boy let go of Alaric and ran into her arms, pressing his face into her side. She cradled him close, inspecting the cloth, the missing tooth, the shaking shoulders. "I told you not to go near the orchard," she began, then stopped. Her gaze flicked to Alaric. She hesitated. "Thank you," she said at last, quiet, uncertain. Alaric nodded once and turned away. He was halfway down the lane when her voice came again, gentler this time. "You'll have bread at your door before dusk." He did not look back. The sun was leaning low by the time he returned to the shop. The air had turned golden, casting long shadows across the floorboards. He set down his tools without cleaning them. There would be time for that later. His back ached from the crouching, and the heat had made his robe cling damply to his skin. He pulled open the small chest near the hearth. Inside were only a few things. A folded tunic that had once belonged to Hob, a bit of waxed twine, a pouch of dried lavender. Beneath these, wrapped in waxed cloth, lay his father's knife. He drew it out now, slowly, the way one handles something not just sharp, but full of memory. It was not a tool for dentistry. It had never been used in the shop. The blade was curved, the handle made of deer antler, worn smooth by time. His father had used it to cut leather and sometimes meat, though Alaric remembered most the way he used it to carve names into wooden boards, quietly, with great care, as if the act of naming was sacred. Alaric turned the knife over in his hands. He had never used it. Never dared. It belonged to a different world, a world where pain came from accident, not duty, where blood was the result of life's sharp corners, not something drawn out by necessity. He wrapped it again and placed it back. As he rose, the floorboards creaked behind him. Someone was there. He turned quickly, but the room was empty. Only the fire crackled. Still, he felt it, a presence, not sinister but familiar, like the scent of an old room left undisturbed. He crossed to the door, opened it and looked out. The street was empty. The sky above Thornwick had deepened to violet, with stars beginning to tremble at the edges. Smoke curled from chimney tops and voices murmured from windows where oil lamps had just been lit. Then he saw her, Myra. She stood across the road, half-shadowed behind a tree, her face still wrapped in linen. Her cloak was different now, thicker, and she carried a satchel over her shoulder. When she saw him, she stepped forward, then paused. He didn't call out. Instead, he stepped aside and let the door swing open. She entered like wind passing through a curtain, quiet, uncertain, and strangely welcome. "I made it as far as Eldmere," she said, her voice rasping. "But I couldn't stay." Alaric didn't ask why. He simply nodded and gestured toward the chair. She shook her head. "I didn't come for that." She pulled something from her satchel and placed it on the table, a small glass jar, its lid wrapped tightly with cord. Inside, a thick amber-coloured salve. "For wounds," she said. "The nuns taught me." Alaric picked up the jar, turned it in the fading light. The salve glowed faintly, and when he opened it, a scent of honey, myrrh, and pine drifted out. "It draws out infection," she added, "eases the swelling." He closed it gently and set it beside the pliers. It did not belong with them. It was something different, something clean. She looked around the room, eyes resting on the hearth, the tools, the old cup. Then she looked at him. "I know what this place is," she said, "what it takes from you." He met her gaze. "Do you?" She nodded. "And I know what it gives back. Nothing." The silence stretched again. "I could stay," she said softly. "Help. Boil the water. Clean the cloth. Mix salves. You don't have to do it alone." Alaric said nothing for a long time. Then he sat, resting his hands on the edge of the table, feeling the smooth grain beneath his fingers. "There's no pay. I don't need coin. There's no peace. I've had enough of silence." They sat like that as the light dwindled and the shadows rose. Outside, the wind shifted. A storm was coming from the north. The smell of it was in the air, wet earth, distant rain. And inside, for the first time in years, the shop did not feel empty. That night, the rain came with a suddenness that startled even the owls into silence. Thick drops fell hard against the thatched roof, drumming like 1,000 restless fingers. Wind curled around the corners of the shop, whistling through the slats, slipping under the door to chill the stone floor. Alaric stoked the hearth until it glowed red and steady, then handed Myra the roughest blanket he owned, scratchy wool but warm. She sat across from him, not at the patient's chair, but on the small stool he used when waiting between visits. She had pulled her cloak tight around her, the satchel resting by her boots. Her eyes wandered over the walls, where herbs hung from twine and bottles lined the shelves, most empty, others filled with strange things. Dried roots, pale stones, blackened teeth sealed in resin. Alaric rarely noticed these objects anymore. To him, they were tools, parts of a routine that dulled the weight of memory. But she looked at them as if trying to understand what kind of man would live among such relics of pain. "Do you ever forget the screams?" she asked quietly, eyes still scanning the shelves. Alaric paused, hands resting on his knees. The fire popped behind him, sending sparks up into the chimney. "No." Mera nodded, unsurprised. "Me neither." Neither spoke for a while after that. The rain deepened, turning the world outside into a sheet of sound. Somewhere in the dark, a shutter banged loose on a neighbouring cottage, and a dog barked once, then fell silent. Mera reached into her satchel and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She unfolded it slowly. Inside were vials and dried plants, tiny pots of ash, a spoon carved from horn, and a small wooden mortar. She laid each item carefully on the table, handling them with the reverence of a priestess laying out relics. "These are what the sisters taught me to use," she said, "for fever, for bleeding, for rot." Alaric leaned forward slightly, studying them. The smells drifted up, pungent, earthy, sharp. Wormwood, valerian, rue, things he had used once and forgotten. Others he had only heard of in whispers. "You learned quickly," he said. "There was a girl, Branka, 8 years old. She was dying from an infected wound on her thigh. They let me sit with her every night. I would clean the skin, pack it with salve, sing to her while she wept. She lived. That's when they let me stay." Alaric looked at her more closely now, not just the bandage on her cheek or the tired set of her shoulders, but the quiet steadiness in her voice, the kind that came not from training, but from having watched life slip close to death and pulled it back. He gestured to the tools on the bench. "Do you know how to pull a tooth?" "No," she said, "but I know how to help someone survive it." He nodded slowly. They worked in silence after that. She cleared a space near the hearth and began sorting her herbs, grinding some into powder. Others she soaked in a shallow bowl of warmed rainwater. Alaric sharpened his pliers, tested the hinge of a jaw clamp that had begun to rust at the joints. He boiled linen, fetched fresh water, and emptied the blood bucket behind the shop before the stench thickened with the damp. By the time the candles had burned halfway down, the room smelled not of iron and sweat, but of pine, mint, and beeswax. A strange warmth filled the corners, not just from the fire, but from something subtler: order, purpose. The presence of another soul who did not flinch at pain, but leaned into it with gentleness. They ate a small supper of boiled oats and dried apple slices, shared on a single wooden plate. "Tomorrow they'll come again," Alaric said softly. "The man with the broken molar, the girl whose gum is black, the merchant who chews cloves all day and swears he's healed." Mera smiled faintly. "Then tomorrow we get to work." That night she slept on the floor by the hearth, wrapped in her cloak and blanket, the satchel tucked beneath her head like a pillow. Alaric lay in the back room on his straw mattress, listening to the rain as it softened. His body ached, but for once he did not feel alone in the ache. Sleep came fitfully. He dreamed of his father, not as he was in the end, struck down by fever, but in the forge, arms black with soot, calling for young Alaric to bring more coal. In the dream, Alaric did not obey. Instead, he stood at the doorway, watching as the fire grew too hot, and the iron began to melt, warping the blade his father had spent all week shaping. Flames curled around it. The anvil cracked. His father looked up then, not angry, but tired, and said nothing. When Alaric woke, the room was still dim with early light, and he could hear Myra stirring near the hearth, gently adding kindling to the coals. He rose slowly, stretched his back, and stepped out into the chill morning. Mist clung to the rooftops like wool. Birds had begun their tentative calls, and smoke drifted from the baker's chimney. At his doorstep, as promised, sat a small loaf of bread, wrapped in linen, still warm. The scent of rosemary clung to it. Alaric lifted it carefully. He did not know what the day would bring, but for the first time, he was ready to meet it with more than pliers and silence. The bread was soft and fragrant, its crust golden and split slightly where steam had escaped. Alaric held it in both hands for a moment, letting the warmth soak into his palms before carrying it back inside. Mera looked up as he entered, her eyes still touched by sleep, hair falling loose from her braid. She had already swept the floor and cleared the table of last night's herbs. The fire had been coaxed into a small blaze, steady enough to boil water but not too hot to choke the room with smoke. He broke the bread in half and set one piece beside her without a word. She accepted it silently, tearing small bites with her teeth, chewing slowly. Neither spoke as they ate, but there was comfort in the quiet, a rhythm already forming between them. When the morning bell rang from the chapel on the hill, the first knock came at the door. It was a woman, middle-aged, her hands red from washing, her lips pressed thin as thread. She held the hand of a boy no older than 6, his mouth tucked behind the collar of her sleeve. Alaric opened the door fully and gestured for them to enter. "He won't eat," she said as the boy clung to her. "Says his tooth sings to him, wakes crying every night. I tried onions, garlic, clove oil, nothing helps." The boy was pale, his eyes sunken from lack of rest. Alaric knelt to meet him at eye level, but the child buried his face in his mother's skirt. Myra stepped forward gently, holding a small piece of dried peppermint leaf in her palm. "Here," she said softly. "Chew this, it won't hurt. Tastes strong, like the wind in the woods." The boy peeked up at her, wary. Slowly he took the leaf and placed it in his mouth. The bitterness surprised him, but he didn't spit it out. His hands unclenched just slightly. Alaric moved with quiet efficiency. He lifted the boy gently onto the chair and waited until the child relaxed into the wood. He opened the boy's mouth carefully. The culprit was easy to find, a molar halfway through the gum, swollen red around the edges. It had tried to grow in crooked, and now it sat at an angle, pinching nerve and flesh. "Just pressure," Alaric murmured, mostly to Myra. "Hasn't broken the skin yet, but it's close." Myra dipped a clean cloth into the hot water and wrung it tightly. She folded it into a neat square and handed it to Alaric, who placed it carefully against the boy's cheek. The heat would help soften the tissue. He began to press gently against the gum with the back of his spoon, coaxing the tooth forward without force. The boy whimpered, but did not cry. Myra rested her hand lightly on his arm, humming a soft tune under her breath, a slow, winding melody that might have been a lullaby or a prayer, the kind of song that threads through sleep and sorrow alike. After some minutes, the tooth shifted. With a quick motion, Alaric grasped it with the smallest of his pliers and tilted it forward. It came free with a wet pop, blood welling up behind it. He stuffed the space with cloth and handed the tooth to the boy's mother. She looked at it, then at him, and for the first time she smiled, small and weary but true. "You've a steadier hand than most priests," she whispered. Alaric didn't respond, only nodded and opened the door for them. As they stepped out into the brightening day, Myra began cleaning the tools, humming still. The boy looked back once, the cloth still pressed to his cheek. His eyes no longer held fear. They saw 6 patients that morning. A shepherd with a shard of bone lodged between 2 teeth from biting down on a lamb's knuckle, a spinner with gum-lined sores from years of chewing bitter root to stay awake, an old man who hadn't spoken in days, not out of illness, but because his dentures had cracked and left splinters in his jaw. Each came and went quietly. Myra learned quickly. She boiled linens before Alaric asked, cut herbs with exacting fingers, and reminded him when he forgot to drink water. She kept a separate bowl of steeped marigold and lavender, dipping her fingers in it to soothe her skin after long hours of scrubbing. Once, Alaric watched her as she ground comfrey root into a poultice, her movements patient and precise, her brow furrowed in concentration. "She's good," he muttered to himself. At midday, they sat together and shared what remained of the bread, dipping it in a broth Myra had made from dried peas and onion skin. The fire crackled softly behind them, and the sounds of the village rose like a lullaby, distant laughter, the creak of a wheelbarrow, a dog barking once, then twice. "How long do you think you'll stay?" Alaric asked, his voice low. Myra shrugged. "Long as I'm useful." "You are," he said, "but usefulness fades." She looked at him, not startled, but searching. So does loneliness. That night they worked late. A farmer stumbled in just as the stars began to blink overhead, one hand wrapped in a blood-soaked rag. His mouth had been broken in a brawl, 4 teeth shattered, gum torn nearly to the bone. He groaned through clenched lips as Alaric examined him. Myra knelt beside the hearth, preparing the strongest tincture she could make without rendering the man unconscious. She mixed valerian root with crushed poppy seed and poured it into a cup. The farmer drank deeply, then slumped against the chair, his breath growing slow. Alaric worked quickly. Each shattered piece had to be removed cleanly to avoid infection. Myra stood beside him, wiping sweat from his brow, handing him cloth after cloth as the blood ran freely. It took nearly an hour, but when it was done, the farmer was still breathing, his jaw bound with linen. They laid him on a blanket near the fire and sat in silence, the air heavy with iron and ash. Outside, thunder rumbled. Inside, the fire burned low, and the toothman did not feel quite so alone. Morning came slowly. The fire had burned itself into soft embers, and the room was bathed in a pale grey light that filtered through the slats in the wooden shutters. Rain had not fallen during the night, but the air was damp and heavy, and a thin mist curled along the street outside, cloaking Thornwick in silence. The farmer still slept on the floor by the hearth, jaw bound tight in linen, breath shallow but steady. Mera had watched over him through most of the night, waking Alaric only once when his pulse stuttered near the edge of fever. Together they had pressed a cooled cloth to his brow, whispered comfort and listened to the slow battle inside his body. Now, Alaric stood over the man once more, studying the colour of his skin, the clarity of his breath. He looked better than expected. Pain would follow, of course, days of it, dull and deep, but he would live. That was more than most could ask for when they came through the toothman's door. Myra set a pot of water to boil, adding a sprig of rosemary for the scent. The room needed it. The metallic tang of dried blood clung to every timber. She moved slowly, hands steady but her shoulders tight with fatigue. She hadn't slept, not really. Only dozed in fits against the wall as the fire warmed her back. Alaric watched her for a moment, then spoke. When Hob trained me, he told me never to grow fond of the ones who walk in. Mera raised an eyebrow. Did you listen? He shook his head. I tried. She smiled, faint and without humour. It's the trying that breaks you. They didn't speak again until the water had boiled and the farmer had stirred. Mera helped him drink a few mouthfuls of thin broth while Alaric repacked the dressing around his jaw. The man winced but said nothing. He gave a weak nod of thanks before Mera helped him to his feet. Alaric gave him a satchel of salve and instructions for rinsing the mouth with warm water steeped in thyme. The man shuffled out into the mist, hunched like a scarecrow, leaving a trail of warmth and blood in his wake. Then the door closed again and the hush returned. They cleaned in silence. Tools scrubbed with ash and water, cloths soaked and wrung, the floor swept twice and mopped with a mixture of vinegar and crushed mint. When it was done, Myra lit a candle and placed it in the window. For luck, she said simply. The rest of the morning passed with no knock at the door. Alaric found himself grateful. He used the quiet to tend to the oldest of his tools, restringing a fine wire pick, sanding the wooden handle of his favourite pliers where a splinter had worked its way free. Myra reorganised the shelves, separating what was still useful from what was too far gone. At midday, the door creaked open. It was a man neither of them recognised. He wore the brown robe of a lay brother, hood pulled low over his eyes, hands clasped beneath the folds. He carried no satchel, no herbs, no coins. His boots were thick with mud. When he lifted his head, Alaric saw that his face was lean, sunburnt, and his mouth was twisted slightly to the left, paralysis perhaps, or the residue of an old wound. He bowed slightly at the waist. "Peace be with you," he said. Alaric nodded once. "And with you." "I'm not here for a tooth," the man added, stepping forward. "I bring a message." Alaric felt a chill despite the fire. Myra set down the jar she'd been cleaning. "From whom?" she asked. The man glanced at her, then back to Alaric. "There's a boy in the hills, a noble's ward, from Haldenmere. He fell from a horse 3 nights ago, broke his jaw, crushed 3 teeth. They tried to bleed him, then sent for a priest. Neither did much good. Now they want someone with a steadier hand." Alaric was silent. Haldenmere was nearly a full day's walk north through thick woods and narrow paths. He had not left Thornwick in years. "Why me?" he asked. "The priest said you're the only one between here and Wessex who knows what to do." Alaric stared at the man for a long moment. Then he turned to Mera. She was already packing the salves. "I'll stay here," she said softly. "Watch the shop." "I don't. You can't leave the boy to priests and leeches. You know it." Alaric looked down at his hands, stained and cracked, then nodded. He packed lightly. Pliers, small spoon, linen, 2 jars of salve and Mera's peppermint tincture. She handed him a wool cloak and tucked a piece of flatbread into the satchel. If it's worse than they say, don't try to be gentle, she said. He met her eyes, and for the first time he allowed himself to touch her, just lightly, a brush of his fingers against her wrist. Then he turned and followed the lay brother out into the mist, the road stretching ahead like a ribbon woven into fog. As the door closed behind him, Myra stood alone in the quiet, watching the candle in the window flicker softly in the pale grey light. The path to Holdenmere was one Alaric had walked once in his youth, when his hands were steadier and his back did not ache with every mile. Then it had been autumn, with leaves crunching beneath his boots and birdsong threading through the trees. Now it was summer's breathless decline, and the forest air hung thick with moisture, swollen with the scent of moss and decay. The trail narrowed quickly beyond the Thornwick fields, winding through dense woods where the underbrush crept close and thorns clawed at the hem of his cloak. The lay brother walked ahead, silent, unbothered by the brambles or the damp. He moved like someone who had walked this route many times, and Alaric was glad to follow rather than lead. His satchel grew heavier with each step, though it held little more than a few tools and cloth. It was not the weight of what he carried, but the weight of what might await him. As the sun began to sink behind the hills, they came upon the estate, a modest stone manor ringed with wooden fencing, nestled low between two hills that held the mist like cupped hands. Holdenmere had once been the seat of a minor lord, but war and misfortune had reduced it to little more than a hunting lodge with aspirations. Still, the manor stood proud, ivy creeping up its walls, and banners hung from narrow windows, limp in the still air. The gates creaked open, and two guards stepped forward, spears in hand. They looked Alaric over, taking in the satchel, the worn boots, the eyes that had seen too much. "He's the one?" one of them asked the brother. "He is. He is." They let him pass without another word. Inside, the manor was dimmed by candles that guttered in iron sconces. The air smelled of dried herbs, old meat, and something sharper, something rotting. A tall woman met them in the hall. Her dress was black, finely stitched but plain, and her eyes were sunken with sleeplessness. "I am Lady Brenner," she said, voice brittle. "You've come for my ward." Alaric bowed his head slightly. "I'll do what I can." She led him up the stairs without ceremony, through a corridor lined with faded tapestries, and into a chamber where the heat struck him like a furnace. The shutters had been drawn tight, and several candles flickered against the heavy curtains. The boy lay in the bed, his face turned toward the wall. He was young, no more than 10, pale as milk. His lips were dry and cracked, and his jaw was swollen to twice its size, purple and black where the bruising had taken hold. One eye was nearly swollen shut. His breathing came in small, wheezing gasps. "He hasn't eaten in 2 days," Lady Brenner said softly, "and the bleeding comes and goes." Alaric moved to the bedside. He knelt slowly, placing his satchel beside him. The boy's mouth was partially open, and the breath that came through it was foul, sour with infection. He placed a hand gently on the boy's temple. The skin was hot. "Has he spoken?" Alaric asked. "Only in fever. He calls for his brother." Alaric began unpacking his tools. He called for clean cloth, a basin of water, vinegar if they had it, Myra's peppermint salve. The lady did not move. Instead, the lay brother bowed again and left swiftly to fetch the supplies. When the boy moaned, Alaric placed 2 fingers gently under his jaw, trying to feel where the bone had split. It was worse than he'd feared. The jaw was not only fractured, it had been driven upward, likely when the boy fell, lodging one tooth deep into the flesh of the gum. Another had broken at the root, the jagged edge now pressing against the nerve. He glanced at Lady Brenner. "This will not be clean." "Just save him," she said. "His family has already lost 2 sons to fever. He is their last." Alaric began. He packed the boy's mouth with cloth to slow the bleeding, then poured a weak vinegar solution along the gum to kill what infection he could. The boy stirred, gasping, but did not wake fully. Alaric worked quickly, his pliers slipping into the ruined mouth, grasping the shattered root and twisting gently, then harder. It broke free with a shudder. Blood welled up, dark and thick. The second tooth was deeper, embedded behind the break in the jaw. He had to angle the pliers back almost blindly and push against the swelling to find purchase. The boy convulsed slightly, limbs twitching, and Lady Brenner moved to restrain him, holding his arms tight. A soft crunch echoed in the room. The tooth came loose. Alaric pulled back, soaked the cloth, and pressed it firmly against the wound. The boy let out a long, rattling sigh, and for a moment Alaric feared it was his last. But then his chest rose again, slow, shallow, but steady. Lady Brenner watched in silence, tears streaking down her cheeks. The lay brother returned with clean cloth and water. Alaric rinsed his hands, packed the wound with Mera's salve, and wrapped the boy's head in linen to brace the jaw. "He'll sleep now," he said. Lady Brenner exhaled shakily. "And when he wakes? There will be pain, but he'll live." She collapsed into a chair, her hands trembling. "Thank you." Alaric said nothing more. He cleaned his tools in the basin, dried them carefully, and repacked the satchel. The candles burned lower now, and the scent of mint and vinegar had overpowered the room. He left without fanfare, descending the stairs slowly, muscles stiff. In the great hall, a servant pressed a pouch of coin into his hand, but Alaric did not look inside. He tucked it into his cloak and stepped out into the mist. The sky was still overcast. Night was falling again, the forest calling him home. And somewhere behind him, a child was sleeping, still in pain, still healing but not dying. And that was enough. The forest was thick with fog as Alaric made his way back toward Thornwick. The trees closed around him like old bones, gnarled and whispering, their limbs creaking softly in the hush of night. He walked slowly, every step measured against the pull of fatigue in his legs and the dull ache that had begun to bloom behind his eyes. The satchel at his side thumped gently with each step, and though it was lighter now, the memory of the boy's torn jaw weighed heavier than any tools. Above him, the sky had turned to ink. A few stars peeked through the cloud breaks, blinking as if in warning. Somewhere in the dark, a nightjar called, its low croon echoing between the trunks. Alaric moved like a man half dreaming. He followed the trail more by memory than sight. Every so often he would pause, place a hand against a mossy tree and wait for the dizziness to pass. His fingers were stained with old blood. He had not stopped to wash properly. By the time he reached the edge of Thornwick, the sun had begun its slow climb behind the eastern ridge, bleeding gold into the fog. The village roofs shimmered in dew, and smoke began to curl from chimney pots like slow breath from sleeping mouths. All was quiet. The shop door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the room had been cleaned. The hearth swept, the bench wiped down, herbs sorted into neat bundles. The air smelled faintly of rosemary and beeswax, and on the stool near the window sat Myra, her eyes closed, head resting against the frame. She stirred as he entered, blinking away sleep. "You're back," she murmured. Alaric nodded and dropped the satchel beside the hearth. He sank onto the nearest chair and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "He lived," he said simply. Myra rose, moved toward the basin, and fetched a clean cloth. She dipped it in cool water and knelt before him, wiping the blood from his fingers. He didn't resist. The water stung, but he welcomed it. A kind of penance. "You're bleeding," she said. Alaric looked down. His right palm bore a small gash, likely from the jagged tooth he'd pulled. He hadn't noticed. She wrapped it gently, hands careful and practiced. "I kept the door shut," she said quietly. "Only old worm came by, left eggs on the step." Alaric almost smiled. The warmth of the room began to settle into his bones. The fire flickered quietly, casting orange light across the floorboards. Outside, the first stirrings of village life began, footsteps on gravel, the creak of carts, distant voices. But here in the shop, time slowed. He closed his eyes. For a moment, the silence was complete. Then came the knock. A soft, hesitant rap, 3 times, then once more, barely audible. Myra opened the door. A girl stood there, hair wild around her shoulders, a smear of mud on her cheek. Her hands were clasped tightly around a small woven pouch. "I heard the toothman lives here," she whispered. Myra nodded. The girl's eyes flicked toward Alaric, who looked up, face hollow with exhaustion. "It's my sister," the girl continued. "She can't eat, not since Candlemas. She says the light hurts her mouth." Myra crouched slightly. "Where is she?" "At the edge of the woods. We sleep in a shepherd's hut." Alaric stood slowly. His body protested, but he reached for the satchel again, refilling it with clean linen, mint salve, and a new bottle of tincture Myra had prepared during his absence. He looked at Myra. "Will you come?" She nodded. "Always." The girl led them through the village, past crooked fences and moss-covered stones, to the far edge where the forest pressed close. There, hidden beneath the twisted boughs of an old pine, was a crumbling shepherd's hut, walls of stone, a roof patched with sod and old hides. Inside, the air was sour with rot. The girl's sister lay curled on a straw mat, her face half covered by a woolen scarf. Her mouth trembled with every breath. Myra knelt beside her, peeled back the scarf gently, and gasped. Her gums were black, not just inflamed but gangrenous, tissue dying, peeling back from the teeth like old bark. The smell was sickly sweet, unnatural. Alaric moved in beside her, fingers pressing lightly on the girl's jaw. Her eyes opened, bloodshot, fever-glazed, and a low whimper escaped her throat. "How long?" he asked. The younger sister wrung her hands. "Since the snow melted. It started as a sore. Then she bit something hard and it bled. She hid it. I didn't know until last week." Myra handed Alaric a cloth soaked in peppermint and myrrh. He pressed it gently to the girl's lips, murmuring soft nonsense words meant only to comfort. Then he reached for the long pliers. 2 teeth would need to go, perhaps 3. The rot had spread past the gum line, curling around the root like ivy choking stone. Myra wrapped the girl's arms in linen, not to bind her, but to steady her. She sang again, low and steady, the same melody she'd used for the boy with the molar. Alaric worked quickly. The girl thrashed once, then went limp, breath rattling. The teeth came free, black as coal, and dropped into the basin with a soft thunk. He packed the wound with Myra's strongest salve, pressed cool cloths to the girl's cheeks, and whispered something he hadn't said in years. "You're safe now." They stayed until her fever broke. When the sun reached its peak above the trees, Alaric and Myra stepped outside again, blinking in the light. The girl stood beside them, wide-eyed and silent. "She'll live," Myra said softly, "but you'll need to wash her mouth every day, boil thyme, use warm water, keep her fed, soup, nothing hard." The girl nodded. Alaric gave her a final look, then turned back toward the village. His satchel was lighter again, but his steps were steady. The walk back to Thornwick was quiet, save for the slow hum of bees drifting among the wildflowers that clung stubbornly to the edges of the road. The forest had receded behind them, and with it the shadow of rot and fever. Still, Alaric could not shake the memory of the girl's blackened gums, the tremble in her jaw as the dead teeth came free, the way her sister never once looked away. Myra walked beside him, her satchel slung across her back, the hem of her cloak brushing the tops of the grass. Her silence was not weariness, but reflection. She had seen worse, they both had. But there was something in the girl's eyes, something too old for such a young face, that clung to her like smoke. As they reached the outskirts of the village, the sun filtered through the clouds in long ribbons of gold. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the air smelled faintly of rye and wet stone. A few villagers glanced up as they passed, but none approached. Word had spread. The toothman walked with company now, and no one quite knew what to make of her. They reached the shop just as the wind began to rise, tugging at shutters and doors, carrying the promise of a coming storm. Alaric stepped inside first and paused. The room was not empty. A man stood near the hearth, his cloak damp with travel, hands folded over the pommel of a walking stick. He turned as they entered. His face was lean, the skin weathered by sun and wind. His eyes, pale and steady, flicked from Alaric to Myra, then back again. "You're late," he said. Alaric narrowed his eyes. "You're not expected." The man chuckled dryly. "True enough, but I've come all the same." He stepped forward, removing a small pouch from his belt and placing it on the table. The weight of it made a dull clink. "A gift," he said, "from the prior of Thorn Abbey." Alaric didn't touch the pouch. "What for?" The man shrugged. "You're of gratitude. Rumour has it you saved a noble's heir in Haldenmere. That kind of deed stirs interest. The Abbey takes notice of those who pull souls back from the edge." Myra moved to the hearth, stoking the fire, though her eyes remained on the stranger. Alaric crossed his arms. "If the Abbey's grateful, they can send clean linens and fever root, not coin." The man smirked. "Consider it both. Coin first, the rest to follow." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "They'll send for you again, sooner than you'd like." The door closed behind him with a soft thud, leaving the shop in quiet once more. Alaric picked up the pouch and opened it. Inside were 6 silver groats and a single iron ring, a seal marked with the sigil of the Abbey, a flame in a circle of thorns. He set it down slowly. Myra watched him from the fire. "They want something," she said. "They always do." He placed the ring in the drawer beside his father's knife and tucked the groats into a jar beneath the shelf where they would not be seen. The rest of the day passed in a slow blur. A weaver came with swollen gums, his mouth full of thread fibre and blood. A miller's wife sought help for her husband, who had broken a tooth chewing dried pork. Alaric worked in steady rhythm, his hands practised, Mera beside him with cloth and salve, always one step ahead. That evening, as dusk settled and the shop grew dim, Alaric pulled a worn book from beneath the hearthstones. Its pages were thin, fragile, filled with diagrams of bones and jaw structures drawn in ink long faded. Mera sat beside him, reading over his shoulder. "Did Hob leave this?" she asked. Alaric nodded. "Found it in his satchel after he vanished. Most of it's nonsense, but some pages, they're true." They studied it together, tracing the sketches, reading notes scrawled in the margins, observations on root length, gum decay, pressure points along the jaw. Myra pointed to a page where someone had drawn a tiny figure screaming beside an oversized molar. "What's that mean?" she asked. Alaric smiled faintly. "That's the one note I understand best." They closed the book as the fire burned low. The wind outside had risen, rattling the shutters. A storm had come, just as the stranger promised. Rain struck the windows in sudden bursts, and lightning cracked across the sky, turning the village white for a heartbeat at a time. They did not speak. Instead, they sat together in the flickering glow, hands stained with the day's labour, and listened to the storm surround them. When Myra finally rose to douse the candle, she paused, looking at Alaric with a quiet seriousness. "They will come, won't they? The Abbey. Others." He nodded. "Will we be ready?" He looked around the shop, at the worn tools, the blood-stained cloths, the herbs hung to dry. "We'll have to be." The storm lasted 3 days. Rain poured in sheets, drumming on the roof until the thatch sagged with moisture. Water pooled beneath the shutters, seeping in through the warped timber, soaking the floor near the hearth. Wind howled down the narrow lanes of Thornwick like a hound let loose, pulling at shutters, bending trees, and driving even the bravest villagers indoors. The fire in the shop was kept burning day and night, more to keep the damp at bay than for warmth. For those 3 days, no one came. Alaric used the time to repair the leak above the back room, bracing the sagging rafters with iron nails he'd bartered from the blacksmith months ago. Mera boiled old linens, crushed fever root into powder, and ground dried bark into tincture. The shop became a place of quiet preparation, as if the storm were not outside but ahead of them still, gathering, waiting. On the 4th day, the sun broke through. Light spilled across the floor in golden shafts, illuminating the room in quiet warmth. Birds returned cautiously, chirping from the hedgerows. And by mid-morning, the first knock came. It was a young man, hair damp from rain, teeth clenched beneath a bruised lip. He smelled of sweat and old ale, and when Myra pulled aside his collar, the imprint of a boot was visible across his ribs. He said little, only grunted as Alaric examined his mouth. 2 molars had shattered, likely from a blow to the jaw. The gums were torn and already beginning to rot. It would be a long extraction. There was no time for poultices or salves. Myra handed Alaric the strongest tincture they had, and together they worked. The first tooth cracked in half. The second came free with a slurp of dark blood. The man passed out. They cleaned him, bound his wounds, and laid him beside the fire. When he woke, Mara fed him a spoonful of barley broth and handed him a bundle of clean cloth with instructions. "You'll bleed through this. That's normal. If it turns black, come back." He nodded, swaying slightly as he left. More came that afternoon. A child with tooth rot from sugared nuts stolen from a merchant's stall. A woman with abscesses along her gums from years of clenched grief. A peddler who had not opened his mouth properly in a decade, jaw-locked from a bone-deep infection that now seeped through the skin behind his ear. They came with pain, with shame, with eyes that darted away and hands that trembled. And to each, Alaric and Myra offered the same, not comfort but care. They did not speak much between visits. The work left little room for words. But in their quiet, they moved with rhythm, passing tools, folding cloth, pressing poultices into wounds. Their breath synchronized. Their footsteps fell in time. That evening, as they cleaned the basin and laid fresh herbs along the windowsill, Myra turned to Alaric. "There's something else," she said. He looked up. In the letter that came with the pouch from the Abbey, it wasn't just thanks, it was warning. Alaric set down the cloth in his hand. Myra crossed to the drawer, pulled out the parchment she had folded carefully days ago, and opened it. "Prepare thy hands for trials of bone and fire," she read aloud. "The Abbey remembers the blood you touched. Others will come. They will not seek healing." Alaric stared at the parchment, the script curling like smoke across the page. "Who would send this?" he asked. Myra shook her head. "A monk, maybe, or someone watching from within, someone who doesn't agree with the Abbey's silence." He reread the words, then folded the letter and tucked it back into the drawer beside the iron ring. "They'll come," he said quietly. "Do we run?" "No." Alaric replied, "We prepare." That night, as the moon rose full and pale over Thornwick, they worked by candlelight. Alaric honed every edge on his tools, checking for cracks, testing grip and weight. Myra dried a new batch of herbs, belladonna and arnica, valerian and sage, and sealed each in waxed cloth. They cleaned the floors again, restocked the jars, boiled fresh water, and when the fire burned low and the windows glowed faint with starlight, Myra placed a new candle in the window. This one she did not light. Instead, she left it dark, a signal perhaps, a mark. They did not speak of what might come, only that they would be ready. The candle remained unlit in the window for 3 days. No one commented on it. No one needed to. In Thornwick, silence said more than any bell or banner. The villagers passed the shop with sidelong glances. Their steps quickened just slightly, as though the air around the place had changed, grown heavier, more watchful. Still the wounded came. Pain did not care for omens or rumours. There was the midwife's son, who had cracked a tooth while chewing on dried roots to dull hunger. A visiting stonemason with black gums from years of inhaling dust. An old woman who could no longer chew and had taken to swallowing bits of bread whole until one lodged and tore her throat. Alaric and Myra saw them all. They did not speak of the letter again, but it remained in the drawer, heavy in its silence. On the 4th morning the knock came. 3 sharp raps, deliberate, measured. Alaric opened the door slowly. A man stood on the threshold, dressed in the garb of a traveller, his cloak dark with road dust, a wide hat pulled low to shield his eyes. But Alaric saw the telltale gleam of polished boots beneath the hem. Not the scuffed kind worn by peddlers or wanderers. These were crafted by someone who walked not for need, but for authority. The man smiled faintly, though his eyes did not. "You are the Toothman." It was not a question. Alaric inclined his head slightly. The man stepped inside without invitation, eyes scanning the room in a single practiced sweep. He noted the tools, the jars, the rack of herbs. He paused at the unlit candle in the window. Myra stood near the hearth, hands tucked into her apron, her gaze steady. "I am Brother Varick," the man said, turning back to them, "emissary of the Abbey at Thorn." He produced a scroll from within his cloak, sealed with wax. Alaric did not reach for it. "You were summoned," Varick continued, "for what you did at Haldenmere." "I did what was asked," Alaric replied. The man smiled again, tighter this time. "Indeed, and the Abbey appreciates service rendered, but we have need of your hands elsewhere now." Myra stepped forward slightly. "What sort of need?" Varick regarded her for a long moment. "A relic has been found, buried beneath the old cathedral ruins near Wetmore, a relic of bone. The Abbey believes it is sacred, but cursed. The workers who unearthed it fell ill. One man's teeth shattered in his skull. Another began to bleed from the jaw. The monks fear contagion. They fear something deeper." Alaric said nothing. "You are not just a puller of teeth," Varick continued. "You understand infection, decay, pain. The Abbey wants you to examine the site." Myra's voice was quiet but firm. "And if he refuses?" Varick's smile vanished. "Then the Abbey will consider his silence dangerous, and it will not be silence for long." Alaric stared at the man, then finally reached for the scroll. He broke the seal and read. It was brief, a command wrapped in honeyed words, a summons, a threat. He set it on the table. "I need time," he said. "You have until moonrise," Varick replied. "Then we ride." The door shut behind him like a closing crypt. That evening, as the sky darkened to bruised purple, Alaric sat by the hearth, staring into the flames. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows on the walls where the tools hung, silent witnesses to every scream and sob. Myra moved about the room quietly, gathering cloth, grinding herbs, checking the tincture levels, preparing. At last she spoke. "You can't go alone. I have to. They won't just want your help. They want your knowledge, and knowledge like yours. They won't let it stay in your head for long." Alaric didn't answer. She walked to the drawer, pulled out the ring from the abbey, and placed it on the table beside the scroll. "Then take this," she said. "If they decide to make you one of them, this may be the only way back." He looked up at her. Her eyes held no fear, only resolve. Outside, the moon began its slow rise, casting silver light across the cobbled streets of Thornwick. Alaric stood, strapped the satchel to his back and reached for the iron ring. Mara placed a hand on his arm. "Come back," he nodded once. Then he stepped into the night. The road to Wetmore was long and mean, carved through hills that had forgotten kindness and valleys that held the mist like secrets. Brother Varick rode a grey mare with narrow hips and a black mane that flicked like a whip when the wind picked up. Alaric followed on foot. The monk offered him no mount, and Alaric did not ask. He preferred to walk. Each step kept his thoughts grounded. Each stone underfoot reminded him that he was still his own. They spoke little on the journey. Varick seemed content to ride in silence, his eyes fixed ahead, his mouth never moving unless to mutter prayers beneath his breath. He carried no visible weapon, but the stiffness in his posture, the constant tension in his shoulders, told Alaric that this was not a man unfamiliar with violence. And it wasn't only the Abbey's kind of violence, the slow, creeping kind that came in scrolls and sermons. This man had buried others. Of that, Alaric had no doubt. The hills gave way to marshland by the second night. The air thickened with rot and gnats, and the stars above seemed to shrink from the dampness. They made camp near a twisted yew tree, its roots clawing through the soil like fingers seeking something lost. Varick lit no fire. He shared no food. Alaric sat with his back to the tree, chewing on a piece of dried apple Myra had slipped into his satchel before he left. The sweetness was faint, almost forgotten, but it kept the bitterness from settling too deep in his chest. When morning came, the path grew narrower, winding between moss-covered stones and stagnant pools. By midday they reached Wetmore. The ruins were nothing like Alaric remembered. Years ago the old cathedral had been a place of shelter for travellers. A monastery once stood behind it, long since abandoned after the plague swept through the hills. Now, what remained was a skeleton of stone and shadow. The roof had collapsed. Ivy crept along broken arches. The bells had fallen, and one lay half buried in the earth like the tooth of a giant. But even in decay, the place breathed. They passed beneath the crumbling arch of the nave, and there, at the heart of the ruin, a ring of canvas tents had been erected. Hooded figures moved among them, silent and quick, carrying bundles of linen, jars of ash, wooden boxes that clinked with glass. A low chant echoed through the space, not words, not even language, but a sound made to soothe and suppress. Varick led Alaric to the central tent. Inside, the air was cooler. A single table had been placed in the centre, and upon it a shrouded object rested beneath layers of cloth. "Don't touch it," Varick said, his voice flat. "Even the monks wear gloves when they pray beside it." Alaric stepped forward slowly. The shape beneath the cloth was irregular, long, curved slightly. It could have been a rib or a shard of wood, but the smell was unmistakable, rot. Not of flesh, not of meat, but of something deeper, something old. Varick stepped beside him. "It was found 3 weeks ago by masons digging the new foundation. Since then 5 have fallen ill. 1 is dead. The others babble in their sleep. Their teeth have cracked, some torn from their mouths as if by unseen hands." Alaric looked down at the cloth again. "And you think I can stop it? You've pulled more pain from this world than any of us. You've seen what others will not name. If this relic is diseased, cursed, whatever it may be, you will know." Alaric removed his satchel and laid out his tools. He lit a candle, held his hands over the flame to warm them, then reached for the edge of the cloth. He pulled it back slowly. Beneath lay a bone, pale, too pale. Its surface was smooth in some places, worn in others as if gnawed. It was the length of a man's arm, slightly curved, with one end jagged as if broken from something larger. But it wasn't the bone itself that held his gaze. It was the tiny teeth embedded within it, dozens of them. Molars, incisors, premolars, all fused into the surface of the bone, some perfectly preserved, others shattered or melted. Each one bore signs of pain, fracture, signs of extraction and force. "What is this?" Alaric whispered. "We don't know," Varric said behind him. "We only know it weeps." Alaric leaned closer. Indeed, a thin sheen of moisture glistened across the bone, collecting in hollows, dripping into the grooves where the teeth met the surface. He touched none of it, but the air around it felt wrong, charged, as if it had pulled suffering into itself over centuries and now breathed it back. He stepped back. "It isn't natural," he said. "We feared as much." Varric nodded to the guards outside. They entered the tent, silent as smoke, and stood behind Alaric. "What happens now?" he asked. Varric's voice was cold. "Now, we test it. We see what it responds to." "To what end? To see if it can be used." Alaric turned slowly. "Used? You want to make a relic of it?" "The Abbey is not interested in relics. We're interested in leverage. This thing breaks men. If it can be controlled, it can be guided. A weapon. A warning." Alaric felt the weight of the satchel on his shoulder again. Felt the ache behind his eyes, the taste of old blood rising at the back of his throat. "I came here to heal," he said. "And now you'll serve," Varric replied. The guards moved closer. Alaric reached slowly into his cloak, felt the iron ring press into his fingers. He closed his hand around it and made his choice. The iron ring in Alaric's palm was warm, strange, considering the air in the tent had grown cold, dense with a silence that hummed in his ears. It pulsed faintly, not like magic, but like memory. A mark left on him by a place that fed on obedience. The Abbey's symbol of loyalty, of submission. But Alaric had never sworn himself. He let the ring slip from his hand and hit the table with a soft clink, landing beside the relic. Its sound was sharp, final, like the snapping of a bone beneath too much pressure. The guards flinched, as if startled by something unseen. "I will not be your tool," Alaric said, voice low. Varric didn't move. His gaze stayed fixed on the ring. "You already are. You've pulled rot from more mouths than any monk in the Abbey's history. That makes you valuable. Valuable isn't the same as willing." "You mistake yourself," Varric replied coolly. "Willingness is irrelevant." The guards stepped forward. Alaric reached to his side, hands slipping into the satchel with the same quiet deliberation he'd used 100 times before. But this time, he didn't pull out a file or a clamp. His fingers closed around the handle of his father's knife, the one with the curved bone hilt and the steel edge still sharp after years hidden beneath hearthstones. He drew it slow. The air crackled. "Step back," he said, voice soft, almost a whisper. One of the guards hesitated. The other did not. He lunged forward, hand outstretched, not for the blade, but for Alaric's shoulder. It was a mistake. The knife moved with the same steadiness Alaric used to sever nerves and roots, swift, surgical, efficient. The tip met the guard's wrist, sliced through sinew, and blood sprayed across the relic's cloth. The man howled and fell back. Varric took a step forward, one hand reaching inside his cloak. Alaric raised the blade and pointed it toward the emissary. "You touch me, and you'll bleed just the same." Varric's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. His hand stilled. The second guard dropped his weapon and backed away, blood dripping from his comrade's wrist onto the stone floor. The wounded man groaned, clutching his hand, eyes wild. Alaric stepped back toward the tent flap. The relic still sat behind him, glistening softly in the candlelight, as if fed by the tension in the room. "You brought me here for knowledge," Alaric said. "So here it is. This relic isn't cursed. It's angry, and what you've done, what you want to do, will only wake it further." "You think it can feel?" Varric asked, voice tight. "I think it remembers," Alaric said, and then he was gone. He slipped through the tent flap and into the ruins, knife still in hand, the satchel thumping at his side. He moved quickly, winding through broken pillars, past collapsed archways and pools of standing water. The fog had returned with the dusk, thick and clinging, muffling sound and light alike. He did not stop until he reached the tree line. There, among the twisted oaks and low brambles, he paused, breath ragged, body aching. The fog curled around him like fingers. Behind, the chanting had begun again, faint and distant, as if the Abbey's acolytes were trying to calm something now stirring in the bones beneath their feet. Alaric turned east, toward Thornwick, toward home. The journey was slower this time. He stopped only once, to wash the guard's blood from his hands in a cold stream. The water ran red, then pink, then clear again. He rinsed the blade and wrapped it in cloth, tucking it deep within the satchel. When he reached the edge of Thornwick, the village lay sleeping beneath a blanket of mist. A single light flickered in the window of the shop. He pushed the door open. Myra was waiting. She stood by the hearth, hands covered in balm, the scent of mint and vinegar drifting on the air. She said nothing at first. Her eyes scanned him, his soaked cloak, the blood-stained satchel, the tremble in his hands. What did they want, she asked at last. To make me theirs. Did they? No. He set the satchel down and crossed the room to the basin. She followed, unwrapping a clean cloth. I hurt a man, he said, almost ashamed. Myra dipped the cloth in warm water and began cleaning his hands. You saved yourself, she corrected. His fingers twitched under her touch, but he didn't pull away. I saw something, Myra, a bone embedded with teeth. It was like nothing I've ever touched. She paused. And you left it behind? I had to, she nodded slowly. Then it's not finished. Alaric looked into the fire. No, he whispered. It's only just begun. The days that followed were uneasy. Not because of what Alaric had done, nor because of what might come next, but because silence had returned to Thornwick, and it was not the silence of rest. It was the silence of breath held too long, of eyes watching through shutters, of villagers crossing the road rather than pass too near the shop. The candle in the window remained unlit, and that alone told the village more than any bell could. No one came for treatment. The old man with the grinding jaw stopped sending his granddaughter. The baker, who once bartered eggs for clove oil, avoided the lane altogether. Even the children, who used to dare each other to knock on the door and run, stayed far from the threshold. It was Myra who broke the stillness first. She rose early on the 5th day, wrapped a bundle of dried herbs in linen, and walked down to the well alone. Alaric watched her from the window, the light just beginning to brush the sky, her shadow long and thin on the cobblestones. She drew water, sprinkled mint leaves into the bucket, and poured it out across the threshold of the shop, an old charm, older than the church, older even than Thornwick itself. When she returned, her hands were cold but steady. They'll come back, she said. Pain always finds its way in. But Alaric wasn't sure. Not this time. He had broken something. Not in Wetmore, not in the Abbey's emissaries, but in the thread that had long tied him to the village. His work had never been holy, but it had been trusted. That trust, once cracked, rarely mended. He spent his hours sharpening tools, boiling linen, checking and rechecking the tinctures. He reshelved the dried roots, restoppered the oils, scrubbed the walls with ash and lye until his hands blistered. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about control, about doing what could be done, however small. Myra worked beside him, always just ahead or just behind, as if their movements were connected by some invisible string. She spoke little now, only when needed. But at night, as they sat by the fire, she would hum softly to herself, the same tune she had sung for the fevered girl. It was a lullaby with no words, only the memory of comfort. Then came the raven. It arrived near dusk on the 7th day, a sleek black shadow against the orange sky. It perched on the window ledge, eyes glinting like coal, feathers ruffling in the breeze. In its beak it held a strip of parchment, the edges curled and browned as if pulled from a fire. Myra opened the window. The raven dropped the message into her palm and flew off without a sound. She unrolled it slowly. There were only 6 words. The bone has vanished. Come now. Alaric stared at the message. His mouth felt dry. They lost it, he asked. Myra looked up. Or it left. They packed quickly. He took only what he needed. Pliers, cloth, knife, Myra's salves. She wrapped their strongest tinctures in oilskin and tucked them into her belt. The satchel was lighter than it had been in weeks, but the weight of its purpose dragged on them both. They left without locking the shop. There was nothing left to protect. The road to Wetmore was darker this time. Clouds had gathered again, and though no rain fell, the air buzzed with the charge of something unspoken. The path was emptier, the birds quieter, the trees still. Even the insects kept their distance. They travelled in silence, their boots thick with mud, the dusk pulling long shadows from every root and rock. When they reached the ruins, no one was there. The tents had been torn down or burned. The central tent where the relic had been stored lay in a heap of blackened fabric, its supports snapped like ribs under a boot. The stone floor beneath was scorched, not with fire, but with something more ancient, dark streaks etched into the earth like veins. Mara knelt near the ashes, touching the cold ground with 2 fingers. She inhaled sharply. "It's moved," she said. Alaric stepped forward slowly. The table where he had first seen the relic was gone, but the mark it left remained, a faint indentation in the earth, like the pressure of a long-dead hand. He looked around. There, near the far wall of the cathedral's ruin, something shimmered. A trail. No wider than a hand, no deeper than a boot print. But it glistened faintly, as though whatever had passed had wept its path into the soil. He followed it. It led through the rubble, around the base of a collapsed pillar, and into the remnants of what once had been the monastery's undercroft. A stone stairwell descended into the dark. Mara joined him. They stood there, side by side, staring into the black throat of the ruin. From below there came no sound, no whisper, no air, but the scent drifted up, iron and damp and something deeper, a sweetness like decay, like old bone, like memory. Myra reached for her blade. Alaric took the first step. They descended into the dark. The steps were slick with moss, worn smooth by centuries of prayer and silence. Each one whispered beneath their boots, as if the stone itself remembered every foot that had passed over it. The air thickened with every descent, cool and wet, clinging to their skin like a burial shroud. Alaric moved slowly, one hand brushing the wall for balance. The satchel at his side knocked softly with every step, pliers and vials and Myra's careful bundles of cloth and balm. She followed just behind him, silent, her breath steady. The knife in her hand caught what little light slipped through the cracks above, and for a moment it looked like a splinter of the moon, trembling. At the bottom of the stairwell, the path widened into a stone corridor. The ceiling arched low, forcing them to stoop slightly. Niches lined the walls, some filled with broken urns, others with bundles of dried herbs, long since turned to dust. A chapel, perhaps, once. A place where bones were stored alongside prayers, and both were expected to last. But now the smell of rot overpowered all else. It was not fresh, not sharp. It was deep, settled. The scent of something that had been here far too long. Alaric paused. The trail they had followed above, the faint shimmer, continued here. But it had changed. The streaks were thicker now and darker. Not quite blood, not quite water. A viscous sheen that pulsed slightly when touched by light. "It's not walking," Myra whispered behind him. "It's dragging." He nodded. They pressed on. After some distance, the corridor opened into a chamber. The ceiling vaulted higher here, the air cooler, but no less oppressive. The walls were covered in carvings, faded etchings of saints and martyrs, their faces worn smooth by centuries of damp. In the centre of the room, a slab of stone sat raised on a dais, half covered in moss and shattered candles. And upon it, bones, not human. The relic had returned. It lay curled like a question mark, the long curved piece now joined with several others, fused like vertebrae, forming something that resembled a spine. Teeth still studded the length, more of them now as if it had grown or consumed. Alaric stepped closer, careful, watching how the light danced across its slick surface. "It's changing," Mara said. He nodded slowly. "And waiting." At the base of the dais lay a body. It was a man, robed, his cowl pulled back to reveal a face frozen in a rictus of pain. Blood had poured from his mouth, staining his chest, pooling around his throat. His eyes were open. Shattered teeth lay scattered near his hand. One of the abbey's monks. Mara bent low beside the corpse, touching the edge of his sleeve. "He tried to speak," she said softly, "tried to pray. But his voice was taken," Alaric murmured, through his teeth. They turned back to the relic. Its surface was twitching, minutely but undeniably. The embedded teeth shifted slightly, as if adjusting, as if listening, and for the first time Alaric felt it in his chest. Not fear, not quite, but grief. It wasn't just a relic, it was a memory of suffering given form. He stepped forward and unbuckled his satchel, pulling free a small tin jar. Inside, a paste Mara had mixed days earlier, beeswax, feverroot, powdered mint and myrrh. A salve to ease rot, to seal open wounds. He scooped a bit with 2 fingers and stepped closer. Mara caught his arm. "It's not a wound," she said. "It is," he replied. "Just one the abbey never treated." He knelt before the relic. The bones shimmered, the teeth twitching again as his hand approached. He pressed the salve gently along the surface, first in a thin line, then broader strokes, moving with care as if bandaging a child's broken limb. The scent of myrrh rose thick around them. For a moment the air held still. Then the chamber trembled, not violently but deeply, like something breathing for the first time in years. Mara stepped back. Alaric stood slowly. The relic had gone still. The glistening had ceased. The teeth no longer twitched, but a sound rose around them, soft, muffled, weeping. They turned toward the walls. The carvings, those of saints and martyrs, now bore faces again. Not clear, not whole, but eyes, mouths, tears. The stone itself seemed to grieve. "What did you do?" Myra whispered. "I remembered it," Alaric said. From the far end of the chamber, another stairway descended deeper still, carved in black stone, half hidden behind a curtain of moss. Alaric looked to Myra. She nodded, and they descended again. The black stairwell was narrower than the last. The walls pressed close, carved not by hands, but by something older, water, time, or perhaps even breath. Moss dripped from the stone, long and wet like hair combed down a drowned face. The air was colder here, but not fresh. It clung to their throats and whispered down into their lungs like a promise never made. Alaric led, the candle in his hand flickering weakly. Myra followed close behind, her steps soft, blade drawn again. Though her grip had changed, it was no longer tight with readiness, but calm, as if the weapon were no more than another tool in her belt, like a scalpel or a needle. At the bottom, the steps gave way to soil. It was unexpected. They had walked through stone, through ruin and bone. But here the ground was soft, dark and living, not damp but warm. The earth gave slightly beneath their feet, not like a floor but a field freshly turned. They had entered a vast, low chamber. No torches lined the walls. No altar stood at the centre. Yet the space seemed sacred in its silence. A stillness that carried weight, not like the quiet of a tomb, but the hush before an incision, the breath just before the scream. Alaric raised the candle. The chamber was filled with bones. Not stacked, not buried, but standing. Dozens of femurs, ribs and spines had been planted upright in the earth, their ends smoothed and fused, shaped like stalks of pale wheat in a dead field. And from many, teeth sprouted, not just embedded as before, but blooming, clustered like berries. Some were molars, yellowed and cracked. Others were tiny incisors, gleaming like pearl. One rib bore a full row of perfect adult teeth, top and bottom, as if a mouth had grown sideways through the bone. Mara stepped closer, her breath caught in her throat. "This is no relic," she said. "It's a garden." Alaric did not answer. He walked slowly between the rows, eyes flicking from stalk to stalk. The candlelight danced across enamel and bone, casting long shadows that curled along the walls like crawling limbs. Then he saw it. In the centre of the chamber, something sat upon a stone. Not a person, not a body, but a figure. It was wrapped in old robes, the fabric hanging in tatters. Its head was bowed low, and its arms rested on its knees. At first Alaric thought it was long dead, another husk left behind in this subterranean field. Then it breathed, slow, measured, laboured. The figure raised its head. Its face was a mask of bone and wax, the skin pale and stretched tight across the skull. Teeth lined the lower jaw in 3 rows. The eyes were human, but not quite. They shimmered, not with life, but with the reflection of every face that had ever knelt before pain and begged for relief. It did not speak, but Alaric understood. He stepped forward, gently lowering the satchel to the ground. He opened it slowly, reverently, and removed one of his oldest tools, a spoon file, the edge worn down from decades of use. He placed it on the ground between them. Myra stood behind him, still and silent. The figure raised a hand. It did not take the tool. Instead, it pointed to Alaric, then to the field of bones, then to the satchel again. He knelt slowly. One by one, he removed each instrument, pliers, probes, clamps. Each he placed carefully into the soft soil at his feet. The earth accepted them without sound, swallowing them like seeds. When he was done, the figure lowered its hand. Myra's voice broke the silence. "What does it want?" Alaric looked at her, his voice heavy with understanding. "It wants the pain to be remembered." He turned back to the field, to the garden of teeth, to the rows of silent bone, and he whispered, "So it can end." The figure bowed its head again. The chamber dimmed, and the candle flickered low. The candle's flame danced once, twice, then guttered out. Total darkness pressed in, thick as wool, thick as blood. Myra reached for Alaric's shoulder instinctively, and he did not flinch. Her presence was grounding, even here in the cold mouth of the earth. He could still feel the warmth of the wax between his fingers, but the light was gone, swallowed whole by something older than flame. And yet they could still see. Not with their eyes, not truly. But the chamber around them, its quiet congregation of bones, its soil heavy with the weight of stories long buried, remained etched in their minds like the after-image of a wound. They did not need light to know what surrounded them. The figure had not moved. Its bowed head remained still, hands resting in its lap. But around them, the garden of bone had begun to change. A sound, soft and brittle, rose from the earth, not weeping this time, but sighing. A long collective exhale, as if every tooth, every rib, every fragment of a life once lived had waited centuries to release that final breath. The rows of standing bones trembled slightly, and Myra took a step back, her hand tightening on Alaric's cloak. He did not retreat. Instead, he moved forward again, barefoot now. He had removed his boots beside the satchel, as if some part of him knew that this place was not meant for the shod. His steps were quiet against the loamy soil, his breath slow, his eyes unblinking in the dark. The air around the figure changed. It warmed faintly, the kind of warmth that followed healing, not comfort, but closure. Alaric knelt once more before the seated form, his knees sinking into the earth, and whispered again, not words, but sounds. The hum of voice without language, of breath shaped into meaning by memory alone. And the figure stirred. Its head lifted slowly, the movement creaking like old timber. The 3 rows of teeth glinted faintly in the dark, like pearls beneath still water. The eyes, those mirrored, flickering wells, focused on Alaric. Then slowly it extended one hand. The fingers were long, white and tipped with dull grey nails. At their centre, held gently in the hollow of the palm, lay something small and strange. A tooth, but not just any tooth. It was perfect, pristine, untouched by decay or trauma. Smooth and white, yet glowing faintly from within, like the last coal in a dying hearth. It pulsed softly, not with light, but with rhythm, with breath. Alaric reached forward. He did not take it. He allowed the figure to place it into his hand. As soon as it touched his palm, a chill ran through him. Not cold, not pain, but clarity. He gasped softly, eyes closing, and in that instant he saw a field of patients, each with mouths torn by sorrow, by shame, by silence, 1,000 extractions, 1,000 screams, 1,000 moments of stillness that followed when breath returned and the pain was gone, but something else had taken its place, something heavier. And in all of them, every soul, every wound, he saw the same thing. Not just a need for healing, but for witnessing. For someone to see the pain and remember it. The tooth in his hand hummed softly. Behind him, Mara whispered, "What is it?" His voice was hoarse when he answered. "It's their last pain, the one they couldn't carry." He stood slowly, turning toward her. In the dim, her face was pale, resolute. "Then we carry it," she said, "until it finds rest." He nodded. Behind them, the garden of bone was changing. The stalks of rib and spine began to lower, slowly, gently, as if bowing. The teeth tucked themselves inward, folding into the marrow like seeds retreating into soil. The field became still once more, not as a threat, but as a place of sleep. Alaric and Mera turned back toward the stairwell. The path behind them was clear. The earth no longer whispered of hunger. As they climbed, the silence grew soft again, less a weight, more a blanket. The air lightened, the walls widened, the dampness faded. When they emerged from the ruins, the sky was washed in grey and lavender. Dawn had come. A raven sat on a broken pillar nearby, its head cocked. It blinked once, then flew. Alaric looked at the tooth in his hand, still warm, still glowing. And in that faint, pulsing light, he saw not death, but a promise. They did not speak as they left Wetmore behind. The forest swallowed them quietly, its leaves shimmering faintly in the dawn breeze. Birds stirred overhead, hesitant songs drifting down like dust, but the 2 travellers kept their silence. Alaric walked with the tooth cupped in one palm, his fingers barely curled around it, as though afraid to bruise it with too tight a grip. Myra stayed close, watching his posture, the rhythm of his step. It was different now, slower, more grounded, but not from wariness, from purpose. The path back to Thornwick wound between fields that had not yet been sown, their soil cracked and dry from the long summer. A herder passed them once, leading a small flock of sheep. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on the satchel. The way Mera's cloak was stained at the hem with dark soil. Something about them unsettled him. though he could not say why. By the time they reached the edge of the village, the sun had fully broken above the hills, casting long golden rays across the rooftops. Thornwick was stirring, women sweeping porches, children chasing dogs through muddy streets, a butcher setting out his morning cuts beneath a tattered awning. And still, that unspoken space around the shop remained. The villagers glanced toward it as one might glance toward a grave, unsure whether it should be feared or revered. Alaric and Mara crossed the lane in silence and entered the shop once more. It smelled of rosemary and thyme. Dust danced in the window light, and the tools still hung in perfect order. The fire was cold but clean, and the bench was just as they had left it. Myra set down her cloak and began boiling water. Alaric removed his satchel, unbuckled it, and took out the small tin where the tooth now rested. He placed it on the shelf above the hearth, not hidden, but not on display either, a place of stillness, of waiting. Then he sat. Myra handed him a cup of hot water steeped in mint and barley, and they drank together by the hearth, their shoulders almost touching, though neither seemed to notice. That afternoon the first knock came. A boy, 10 winters old, his mouth swollen, his eyes wide with fear. His mother stood behind him, cheeks sunburned, hands calloused. She said nothing as Alaric opened the door, only nodded once, and pushed the boy gently forward. Inside, the room warmed. Myra took the boy's hand and led him to the chair. She crouched beside him, whispering soft encouragements, her fingers brushing his wrist like a lullaby. Alaric prepared the tools, but something in his movements had changed. He no longer handled them like weapons. They were instruments again, of mercy, of memory. The tooth came out with a sharp twist and a single gasp. Myra pressed cloth to the wound and handed the boy a small pebble wrapped in linen. "For courage," she said. The boy smiled through bloodied lips. More followed. A miller with broken molars from years of grinding stone. A woman who had lost 3 children to sickness and hadn't spoken since the last. A man who brought his daughter, whose jaw ached not from rot, but from silence. They came with wounds both old and unseen, and they left lighter, not healed perhaps, but heard. And each time, Alaric returned to the shelf and looked at the tooth in the tin. It never moved, it never changed, but he felt its hum, soft, subtle, like breath. That evening, as dusk fell over Thornwick, Myra lit a candle in the window, not for warning, for welcome. Alaric stood at the threshold, watching the sky shift from gold to lavender, from lavender to blue. Somewhere in the dark, a raven called once, then fell silent. Behind him, Myra swept the floor, her steps light, and the toothman exhaled, not as one finished, but as one returned.